Okay, let's look at the second of three videos. This one we're going to go with on the Raspberry Pi. The Raspberry Pi is the main reason for this class. I found out about it a couple years ago as soon as it was announced that it was going to be available, and I got one of the first ones. And this isn't it, but essentially I'm fascinated with the potential for what the Raspberry Pi is designed to do. And it's the reason that the Galileo exists, as well as the BeagleBone. A lot of people would say Arduino was first, and they were, but the difference, and the main difference, the key difference with the Raspberry Pi, is that it is a $25 to $35 complete computer that is the size of a credit card. To give you an idea, if you'll look here, that is a standard RCA video plug. Here, in the blue, that is a standard audio jack. Going over to the other side, there is a standard couple of USB ports, and then finally an RJ45 jack. But even better, right here, an HDMI jack. You can connect this into any sort of audio-video system that you want to. In the case of HDMI, it goes on ahead and puts the audio through with the video, as you can see there with the orange piece of cellophane on it. And up here, you can combine the audio and video through, let's say, more primitive, I suppose, types of video systems. All of this is to get kids to do more programming. It was literally designed, they wanted elementary school kids to get into programming on a device dedicated that their parents wouldn't freak out when they started hacking with it and blew something up. What's happened, however, is that the Linux community has gone absolutely nuts for this machine because essentially it allows you to put Linux anywhere, and it does it by using SD cards. In this case, a full-size SD card. And I would like to take this moment while I'm thinking about it to warn you about one of the issues with the Raspberry Pi, the only physical issue that I have discovered, and that is this slot right here. This slot right here, which holds the SD card, will allow you to pull it out and, of course, push it in. It is not one of the push-in, push-out types of SD card slots that you'll see on a lot of other types of systems, such as the BeagleBone and the Galileo. The Galileo you'll be able to use in class using a micro SD card. And in the case of the Raspberry Pi, we have some standard side SD cards, as well as adapters that use the micros. So we've got you covered there. But in any case, power comes through a USB micro port. This is the only USB micro port there is. You have the GPIO pins up here. This is the main correlation with what the Galileo does, as well as the BeagleBone. The BeagleBone uses a pinout system similar to the Arduino. The Galileo uses, of course, the standard Arduino pinout. This is known, this particular block here is known as a general purpose I/O, input-output, or GPIO pin section. And there are a number of pins, each with their own purpose in life, that allows you to connect various devices by using simple wires. You'll notice over here in the corner, next to where you'll see the do not dispose of symbol, the trash can with the X through it, you'll see in the upper left P1. That's where pin 1 is. And what you do is you simply count on down the line on one side and up the other to get all your pinouts correct. This is the most flexible portion of the Raspberry Pi, as well as one of the most problematic, because if you get the wrong pin, in most cases it means you won't get a satisfactory result from what you're trying to build. In certain rare cases, it means that you could severely underpower what you're doing or try to pull too much power through the Pi, etc. In other words, break it. And there are some things, such as a fuse down here, that will allow you to keep these things from happening. But for the most part, my experience has been with students that this slot right here, learning how to use that SD card and put it into that slot in such a way that you don't break this area right over here. This little plastic fin, you'll notice where the edge of the card is and the edge of the fin is. That little plastic fin appears to be incredibly fragile because this is plastic. This plastic box that holds the edge of the SD card, allowing, essentially, a good grip between these pins inside here, which you'll notice are raised, and the contact points on the base of the SD card. So that's one of the concerns. You want to make sure that you have this in nice and gently, and then just enough force to push down those pins. And it kind of clicks in, but it's what you might call a friction hold or a friction connection, where it uses the tight fit of the pieces of plastic together to hold it in. It does not lock it in. It can be pulled out at any time, and that's not as big of a problem as people who are just shoving the card in and not even thinking about it, because we have had a number of these that will stress fracture along this edge right over here. And hopefully that's something they'll address in a future iteration of the Raspberry Pi. Right now it's so successful as is, and the cost is kept as low as possible, that that's not as important as just getting them out there. What you'll also notice here are a couple of slots, this one right there, and then this one over here. These are the only slots that are not commonly used, although one of them is starting to be used for a camera system that they're using for the Raspberry Pi and some of the components that are coming up for the Raspberry Pi. Everybody is making something to hook into this Raspberry Pi, much like with the Arduino community, and the Arduino community, of course, allowing the Raspberry Pi community to interconnect, the BeagleBone doing the same. The Galileo has a bit of an advantage in that it's already Arduino compatible. The software has been fully developed with the Arduino community, so that helps too. But what's interesting about this is everything on this system, the memory and the CPU, which is an ARM-based processor, is right in here. That right there on top is actually the RAM. It sits on top of the chip underneath, which is the actual Raspberry Pi ARM core chip. The only other chip of any significance on the board is this one right here. The only reason that one exists is for the Ethernet over here in the corner. That's the only reason this particular chip exists right here. So in another version of the Raspberry Pi, this one is the Model B. In another version, the Model A, which ironically came after the Model B, that chip is not there, and neither is the Ethernet connector whatsoever. The benefit to that is partly power. It is less expensive in a power sense to run, so a lot of people will use the A model in order to run things off of solar panels, etc., or just in general anything that doesn't need to be network enabled, RJ45 mind you, and that might want to just sip on power versus, I don't know, sip a little bit more on the power. Because the interesting thing is the Raspberry Pi, like the Galileo and like the BeagleBone, all use a simple 5-volt USB standard connection. Now, let me take that back for a moment. The BeagleBone and the Raspberry Pi both use 5-volt connections. The Galileo can, in some cases, be run directly off the USB, but not fully powered. And the BeagleBone can do either USB micro power or a 5-volt barrel jack, much like you saw with the Galileo. The interesting thing again, and this is a concern or a consideration that Raspberry Pi Foundation, the Raspberry Pi Foundation made, was to go on ahead and use the micro USB, counting on the fact that most cell phone manufacturers could make micro USB connectors that allow people to charge their cell phones. The Kindle uses USB as well. Not many manufacturers really specifically manufacture for the kinds of plugs like the Samsung Galaxy tablet uses, or either version of the iPad with the Lightning connector, or its other proprietary multi-pin connector. A lot of your cell phone manufacturers just went with USB because it worked. Some of your tablets, such as the Amazon Kindles, will go on ahead and use a standard USB as well. So the Raspberry Pi Foundation just took advantage of this with the Raspberry Pi and eliminated the need for that barrel connector. It does make the Pi a little bit more susceptible to power issues, and it does require you to buy a power connector right off the bat. We have those, of course, for your class. But the really exciting thing about the Pi is, and a lot of people use the Pi as one-stop shop for your own open source AV system. This is an audiovisual system. You have essentially a home theater system here, a small Roku, if you will, open source. And there are distributions that are designed specifically for running on the Raspberry Pi, versions of Linux that were set up for home video, and as well the Raspberry Pi can be used as essentially a web server. Essentially anything you can do with Linux. These things are all true for any kind of the three devices that I'm going to show you in these three videos. But I would say that the Raspberry Pi is the most versatile in this respect because of the fact that it is not intended to be the brains of an extended electronics system, but intended to be a self-contained unit that is a direct replacement for a PC, if you will, or a tablet. Because of that, it has, ironically, a little bit more flexibility when it comes to where it can be used, considering that Linux already has so many pieces of software. The Raspberry Pi was designed with Linux as its intended operating system, and the fact that it runs Linux fairly well allows you to put the Raspberry Pi in places, and Linux especially, in places that you don't normally put PCs for whatever reason. So this gives us the advantage of taking advantage of all of the Linux operating system programs that can be run, essentially any program that can be run on Linux, as well as all of the systems that Linux uses to connect to the outside world and throws in through the GPIO pins over in the corner here. The ability to do a lot of the Arduino type hobbyist electronics connection kind of things as well too. So I think the Raspberry Pi, especially for teaching computers at a versatile level with a minimum of expense, is the way to go. And it's the reason we kind of created this class and why we're building it around this concept. And the Raspberry Pi itself has lit a fire in the hobbyist community, the maker community, the academic community, in a lot of these ways, by providing a very simple, inexpensive, versatile system that is literally the size of about a credit card. Needless to say, with a lot of bumps and other connections on it, but certainly worth our time to explore in this class. So we'll move on to video 3.